Yes, and now we're faced in the most incredible historical time in the United States. We're talking now February 2019, February 15th, and Donald Trump is saying he's going to declare a national emergency. And I would love to hear your wisdom on.
I always start when I talk about Trump with my major focus on him, solipsistic reality, and we've talked about that before. But
Yes.
we see it operating here, and what it really means is that this man has as his only reality that which is perceived and required by the self.
Mm-hmm.
That means anything can be made up, and it's totally unresponsive to ordinary claims of reality or evidence.
Mm-hmm.
That's the beginning. And he can say all these things. He can declare a crisis when the only crisis is his wildly destructive immigration program and his imagined border chaos. So anyhow, I would start with the solipsistic reality. What I believe is that over the course of his 2-year presidency, he's getting more and more entrapped by his own solipsism.
Mm.
He tries to disseminate it, insists that it be applied to the society. He is president, after all, and the society is increasingly resistive to it.
Mm-hmm.
Even those who hypocritically support him privately, and there's lots of evidence for this, see him as a little mad, perhaps if not crazy, just a little mad. But the solipsistic reality is at the heart of it, and it's accompanied by a nasty attack mode with a strongly paranoid quality. So I think, and this is hopeful, he's in his end game. That means he's moving toward being deposed in some way. The bad news is that it's very difficult to know exactly how that will come about, how long it will take, and how much damage, additional damage, he will do in that process.
Mm.
Certainly, he's gotten more and more grandiose and has lied more frequently and more blatantly in recent months.
Mm-hmm. So I couldn't help but notice the language of deposed, as in a king is deposed.
Yeah. Well, one scenario is that as various forces turn increasingly against him, and he lacks the capacity, the support, the possibility of sustaining any authority, he won't be, without being necessarily impeached, since that's a difficult process. It isn't impossible, but it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
He might resign.
Mm-hmm.
Resign and declare victory, of course. Would say he's been the most effective president ever, as he's said in effect, over at least looking at his first 2 years, and that he has done a lot for the country. His enemies are pervasive, and this is a good time to resign, and he can improve the world's economy through his business. One can imagine him saying those things. Now, we're not at that point, and possibly not even close to it now, but we are at a point where his solipsistic and created reality, self-created reality, is less and less supportable. You know, I wrote that Jerry Bruner, the great psychologist who was a good friend of mine, lived to be 100. In any case, he talked about narrative psychology, and he talked about a concept of narrative necessity, where lies and problematic statements are accepted because the narrative requires them.
Mm-hmm.
And if his supporters embrace strongly and fiercely that narrative, then the narrative takes precedence over lies or strange behavior, attacks on others, because of that narrative necessity. And that brings us to something we're much interested, you and I, in common, and that has to do with the cultic dimensions of Trump and the Trump movement.
Right.
And perhaps I could say something about my recent thinking about that.
That's what I want to listen to you. I don't want to talk. I have a million questions that pop into my head, but I want to hear you speak.
Well, I've thought, as I'm sure you have, there's something very cult-like about the Trump movement. It's not a formal cult in the sense of what the Moonies were when you knew them, or what Om Shinrikyo was when I studied it, with an actual community controlled by a totalizing guru who creates reality that the cult lives in. But it is cult-like, and you get a sense of that even in the chanting at the meetings.
Right.
Build a wall, lock her up. Who's going to build it? It's a back and forth from guru to followers. And there's some evidence that many of those followers have a sense of Trump as an all-powerful, omnipotent guru, and they've really staked their lives on his guruism. I believe. Now, it's not all of his followers, but there's a group of them of some size, of which that's probably true. As he's failing in his authority, he also fails them as a guru. They can no longer, in a sense, get from him what they need, which is absolute truth, absolute virtue, and a sense of being, their sense of his being all-powerful. And as he loses this from many sides, there then is both a political and a psychological or cultic element of his decline. We're seeing a certain amount of the political decline, as various Republicans are contesting him, though not enough. And the cultic decline hasn't been recognized as much. People say, with only partial truth, that that's all covered by cognitive dissonance. Now, Festinger did very good work in cognitive dissonance, and as you know, it's about a cult with the moment in which the world is supposed to end and they're supposed to be picked up by a UFO and taken to some kind of safety. Didn't happen. And many of those followers, when Festinger and his team looked after what they did, they then reasserted their belief in the guru's vision and said, well, we picked the wrong time, or we reasserting that belief in order to sustain their cognitive beliefs.
Yeah, because they had faith. Then the world was granted an extension of survival.
But I think so, and that's an interesting and very important finding, but it doesn't cover everything.
Right.
And that was a single expectation and image of being carried off to safety. With Trump, it's a gradual loss of psychic power and power for disciples. And there I turn to my experience in studying Om Shinrikyo, the fanatical Japanese cult that released sarin gas in Tokyo subway stations in 1995. And when you follow them, especially with the trials and the court proceedings, a number of the leading disciples were outraged at him, denounced him, said he was a false guru, had misled them, denounced him as a criminal. These were people who had staked their whole existence in him.
Right.
When they turned, they really turned.
Right.
So I don't know. It's quite possible we're beginning to see that even now. The situation is very confused because we have people people who say they speak for him or for his base, who are denouncing any compromise he makes. Compromises will upset some of his base, and not, in a sense, remaining strong and worthy of worship will affect some of his base. Now we seem to see more agitation around him, including that which comes from some people who had been fiercely loyal. And it's not too much to expect that some of that fierce emotion, which was directed at him in terms of staking their life on the path that he, as a guru, took them on. And remember, that's an immortalizing path. That same kind of emotion can be transformed into angry resentment for failing them. If even, and this won't happen to the majority of his base, but if even a small portion of those we're used to describing as his absolutely loyal followers were to turn on him in this way, it would be fatal to his presidency, or would fit in with many other things that undermine his presidency. And I think in that way, the cultic dimension of Trump works both ways. It has been a source of his power and influence, and the strange phenomenon we witness of 35% of the American population going along with him, including his lies and falsehoods. But the other side of the coin is the potential source of great danger to him. Should more of them actively and publicly turn against him, which is quite possible, it will also have its effect on him. And I make the point that Shoko Asahara, the guru of Om Shinrikyo, moved quickly into psychosis when a couple of his leading disciples denounced him. He had moved in and out of psychosis anyhow, as some gurus do, but and I don't necessarily expect Trump to do that, but certainly his capacity to feel powerful, which he's constantly struggling to sustain, could be strongly interrupted and undermined.
Right. I'd like to just insert for people listening to this that your book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, which came out in the early 1961, is the edition that I have, about Chinese communist brainwashing, was just one of many studies you've done, including the one you're referencing, Destroying the World to Save It, about apocalyptic cults.
Exactly.
I also want to say Shoko Asahara was hanged after being in jail for 20 years. He claimed to be Jesus and Buddha, and that he was trying to, my explanation given to me by former members was he was trying to instigate the apocalypse and prove that his prophecies were accurate. And that was the rationale behind the gassing of 5,000 Japanese citizens in the Tokyo subways
Yeah.
in 1995.
Yes. He, in that sense, was an activist in his apocalypticism.
Right.
Where, as you know, many cults are very responsive to nuclear weapons, and that, in a sense, confirms and intensifies their apocalyptic feelings. But with Asahara, he embraced what the ancient Jews called forcing the end, forcing the end, which would be taking an active part in the violence that's known to necessarily precede the apocalypse, or in the case of the ancient Jews, the appearance of the Messiah. The ancient rabbis were wise enough to reject the idea of forcing the end. So I read in Gershon Scholem, but some of the present cult leaders may not have that restraint or wisdom, and certainly Asahara didn't.
Right. So there is a difference between religious cults like Shinrikyo and the Moonies. What about Lyndon LaRouche, who just died, who is a political cult leader? Do you want to say anything about him and his conspiracy?
Yes, well, before I say anything, I never studied him particularly, but the general point is, I start this, as you just said, with my study of Chinese communist thought reform. That's a group of political extremism.
Right.
And really that chapter 22 that people in cults used to recognize what they had been put through came from a kind of spiritual, or claim to spiritual clarity and perfection. And what I have discovered is that these seemingly separate tendencies, political and religious, can be psychologically virtually the same. Mm-hmm. They both really, so that with Chinese thought reform, there is a great guru, Mao himself,
right.
And he was certainly looked up to as a guru. And in that sense, the vast Chinese population, much of it became cult-like. Now I call it cultish, or I speak of cultism, to combine these as an all-embracing idea. And the subtitle of the book the book I'm working on now now has the title of Losing Reality. And the subtitle is on cults, cultism, and the mindset of political and religious zealotry. So political and religious zealotry, well, here's a sequence in my work. Thought reform was a kind of political purification, apocalyptic, and I bring out the apocalyptic side of Mao. Om Shinrikyo was an ostensibly religious or spiritual purification and apocalyptic, and even the Nazi movement is a biological purification. And
you wrote The Nazi Doctors, for those who aren't familiar with that work that you did as well.
I did, and as I look back on that now, and even when I wrote that book, I didn't call it cult-like, but certainly millenarial, and I spoke of a mystical biomedical vision and a biological mysticism. So there was a cult-like aspect to the Nazis as well. And all this has to do with claims of absolute purification, which both the political and the ostensibly religious groups embrace. And they, as you yourself discovered personally, they're psychologically so close as to be virtually inseparable, the political and the spiritual apocalypticism and extremism.
Right. And in your book, Death and Life, about the victim of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the victims of the nuclear bomb, you also talked about this, that nuclear weapons change the fundamental structure of how humans relate to reality, because it created for the first time a tangible scene of utter annihilation of everything.
Absolutely. In that sense, the nuclear weapons were immediately technologically apocalyptic. They could do what in the past only God could do,
Right.
destroy the world. And for many, they became something close to an object of worship themselves. I
Mm-hmm.
call that nuclearism. And nuclear weapons also can take on a cult-like quality, and we recognize that when we speak of the nuclear priesthood or the arcane aspects of nuclear weapons. There are just a relatively few people